I mean, I think it's clear that New Orleans is the clear champion when it comes to
Well, I stacked
most
in New Orleans'
desirable
favor by
restaurant.
only putting one New Orleans restaurant on. They all could have been New Orleans
I mean, yeah, we could
restaurants.
have run it. We could have run
Yeah,
it. Could have run it. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. All right. Well, we're already about 10 minutes in, so I assume everybody who's going to join us has joined us. So while I'm still messing with tech, I wanted to share one thing, if I may, briefly. Um, yes. No. Okay. All right. So I don't know if you've all seen this.
It's the data from the poll is what, yeah.
So I just wanted to share that because for those of you who haven't seen it, it is a restaurant in Germany. It's getting a lot of attention, and I think really raises some interesting questions about what a restaurant is. If you weren't able to see it in the short clip, the idea is you get in a like an amusement park, right? Like you get a seat and you go through, and food is brought to you. Um, it really, I think they would say it pushes the boundaries, but maybe not in the best way. Again, this issue is all about restaurants. The stories we tell, they're the stories we tell about them. So I want to turn to each of our contributors, keeping that in the back of our mind about the idea of a restaurant. And John, I'm hoping to start with you. If you could just introduce yourself briefly. I wanted you to talk, I'm hoping, not just maybe about what you wrote for this issue, which is an essay about the tyranny of storytelling in restaurants, but the piece you wrote for Bitter Southerner recently about another restaurant. Maybe if you could talk about, what made that significant to you as a restaurant and restaurant experience compared to possibly what we just saw in Germany.
Okay, and I didn't see the thing in Germany. I'm not sure.
Oh no! Did anybody
Yeah,
see it? Or no,
we just saw the
nobody.
results of the poll, I think.
Like, sad. Oh, that's no good.
Do you want
Oh.
to give us the you know,
Yeah, it's
headline?
oh yeah. So the idea is, as I was saying, it's just it is a restaurant as theme park ride. So you kind of ride through and people come and like chop things up for you when you're going through in the dark. I wish you could have seen it, but I messed it up. I think maybe don't dwell on that.
Okay.
Instead, we'll just move on. Yeah. So but
Hi.
yeah, so if you could talk about, what for you, this restaurant which you just located as a restaurant which was meaningful to you, what that said to you about what restaurants should offer.
So, hey everybody, I'm John Kessler and I am the restaurant Chicago Magazine, but I, spent most of my career at the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, and heart is definitely still in the South. Um, and and I wrote for Hannah for this issue about how so much of what happens now when you go out to eat is storytelling. That it used to feel a little bit more that restaurants had stories, but you kind of had to ask the questions. You went there to, eat things that tasted good and get a sense of the place and pique your curiosity about what it was really about. But I think living in Chicago, and the Bears starting up again tomorrow, and there's this whole background here of these high-end kind of tasting menu restaurants where there's so much story being thrown at us about, when you go out to eat, you're being told, how to eat something, how to, tip something back in your mouth, how to use the fork, what the chef meant by, this particular dish, which is, just a little teensy thing. But there's a long story behind it. So that's one thing that I see as sort of a trend going on. But what Hannah mentioned too is I just recently wrote a longer story for the Bitter Southerner. And that was about an old school continental restaurant in Siesta Key, Florida called Miguel's. And honestly, I just wandered into Miguel's one night. We just arrived for a vacation to visit my mother-in-law. We were in this old ratty old strip mall and wanted to get a drink somewhere, saw this little hand sign in the corner of the strip mall, opened the door, and it was just like this portal to another world. It was like, it was just like something from 50 years ago. And I just remember like the hostess, the woman who greeted us at the door, must have been about 65 or 70. And she was wearing this like, pale blue sweater set, and she had pearls and she had a scarf around her neck. And she was just like, I was like, where are we? And it was such an interesting restaurant because it had been there for a long time. It was owned by a family. And as I went back and got to learn the story of the restaurant, I began to learn the story of Siesta Key and what that restaurant meant to people living there and how it managed to survive all these years. How, one point it was Mad Men and people having drinks and feeling young and racy. And they were in New York. Then now it's kind of, people have aged a lot. And so it's just a lovely older crowd that goes there who's kind of remembering what restaurants used to be. Everything's flambeing and they had to get rid of the ceiling tiles and replace them with black ones because they kept leaving scorch marks. And so to me, that's like a restaurant with a good story. So
yeah, it's interesting you say that, John, because there's also a fiery moment in your piece for Gravy, right? Or
yeah. So one in the Gravy piece, I went to, there's this restaurant here called Next, and it's owned by Grant Achatz, who owns Alinea, which is a very famous 3 Michelin star restaurant, very famous for its modernist cooking that is, contains a lot of sort of magic show moments, lots of smoke and stuff. But at Next, they always have a theme, but the theme changes every few months. And when I went, it was theme. And so, I mean, talk about the tyranny of story. You walk in there, and every course before it gets set down by you, it's like the waiter would come up with this script. And so this represents Julia's, formative years in Cambridge before she started her show. And they'd go through this script to give you this dish. And one of the centerpieces of the whole thing was her boeuf bourguignon, because, that's a dish everybody loves from Mastering the Art of French Cooking. And it was the beef stew that, sort of turned a lot of America on to, the beauty of European kind of cooking and the flavors you can get. But to do it at this restaurant, they brought out a little TV, put on the table to show you an old episode of The French Chef. They brought out a burner, like a Bunsen burner in a pot. And the whole idea is they had a piece of raw beef in this and aromatics, and they're going to pour wine over it and make you feel like, ooh, this is what it's like being in the kitchen as boeuf bourguignon is cooking. And then they just serve you the food. Well, our thing got too hot. And so, the waiter had to go away and the Bunsen burner was heating the pan and all that. And there's the stuff in it. And so finally when he comes and pours on the wine, it was like DEFCON 4. It was like the whole space just filled up with smoke. And it was like, everybody was like, oh my God. And, I think I saw somebody in like behind the bar reaching for like the, fire extinguisher. And it was just like not supposed to go off like that. But it was kind of exciting and it was all fun, but like it wasn't really eating boeuf bourguignon, because then what they brought out was this like really pretty big dish with a little piece of meat that was, all kind of sous vide beef short rib, which was, good, but
Let me turn to Heather. I have a question, but before we do, Heather had a question which she posed in the chat and nobody answered. So you can take yourself off mute. Heather was asking why Dukey's was at the top of the list, and this really gets to the core of what we're talking about stories. For those who chose Dukey's over all those venerable restaurants on that list, is it because, as Heather said, because you've been there or because you've heard about it?
For me, it was because I was there once and it was such such a formative experience, and it lived up to all my expectations. And I would just like to go back to see how it would strike me a second time, especially since Miss Leah is no longer there.
Well, Sherry, the good news is you don't have to go there. You can go to Disney World. Heather,
Right.
so ably written for us about the new ride. I love when I laugh. It says, "Are you playing music?" Has written about the new Disney ride, which is based tangentially on the story of Leah Chase, but I don't want to take it away from her. So Heather, do you want to tell us? I'm so curious to hear because since you've written the piece, you have now been to Disney World to experience this in person. Can you share a little bit with us about Princess Tiana's ride?
Yeah, and I have to say, if anybody from Disney is on the Zoom, seeing the results of that poll, right, that it must be incredibly gratifying for them because I think you all know some of the backstory of Princess and the Frog and Princess Tiana character and how it was inspired in part by Leah Chase. And so Disney has invested heavily, heavily, heavily in the Princess Tiana character. And part of that calculus is the appeal of Leah Chase and the Chase family and Dooky Chase's restaurant. And Leah Chase is an African-American woman chef, right? And she is renowned. I mean, everybody, 70% of the people in this conversation want to go to Dooky Chase's. And if they don't know anything about Dooky Chase, they know about Leah Chase. And so how this story sort of, I guess there are 2 points of genesis for the story. One is that I work at the Historic New Orleans Collection, which is a history museum in the French Quarter. So when the Walt Disney Imagineers were beginning the project of reconceptualizing Splash Mountain into a Tiana-themed attraction, we were one of the museums and archives that they visited. So I've been part of that journey with them. Periodically, they would ask us to pull things out of the archive to address certain themes they were researching on a particular trip. And one of those trips was restaurants and restaurant decor. We happen to have a huge collection that was donated to us by the famous Antoine's restaurant, the famous oldest French Creole restaurant in New Orleans. And in preparing for one of these Disney visits, one of my colleagues, Ishmael Ross, found a Antoine's menu from, now we know, June of 1956 for a private dinner for Walt Disney. And so we started spending time in the Antoine's collection. I was doing some additional research there, trying to understand that menu when I come across the menu that's at the heart of my story, which is another Antoine's menu, undated, we believe pre-war, which in a very unusual fashion features an unidentified Black woman on the back cover of the menu. So think about when this is, right? This is 1940s. This is Antoine's restaurant, a restaurant that has heavily invested in its own, telling its own story of the restaurant, which is very rooted in its French origins. And on the menu, there is this Black woman, and no one in 2023, 2024 knew who she was, even at the restaurant. So I became sort of obsessed with trying to identify her and to figure out why she was there, what they were trying to communicate to diners about the restaurant for her presence. So the story, that sort of became the jumping off of the story. What does it mean to eat Black New Orleans, and how deeply that understanding of New Orleans foodways is intertwined with people like Leah Chase, who we know. But moreover, when you look at sort of restaurants and the food services industry generally, when you look at who was doing a lot of cooking in private homes, in their own homes, it was this legion of unidentified African-American women. So the contrast between this woman on the back cover that everyone has forgotten who she is, with now Disney positioning Leah Chase as the very face of New Orleans foodways in some ways, that becomes the story that I wrote, is sort of exploring that idea.
Great. Heather, before we move on from you, I know it's not any part of the gravy issue, but can you very briefly say what it is you're doing today and how people can, and I mean with the singers and the song, and how people can learn about that?
Oh, you mean my third job this week, in addition to
Yeah,
being
yeah.
A food, right? Yeah. So in a prior life, I think we had some other South Carolinians on the call. In my prior life, I lived on Johns Island, and I was executive director of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. Again, part of this trajectory in my life of being very interested in traditional Southern culture. The Gullah Geechee people have maintained a wide range of African cultural retentions. One of them is a ritual called a ring shout. And there is a similar tradition here in Louisiana, in the northern part of the state, in the Delta, maintained by a group called the Winsboro Easter Rock Ensemble, which also features a ring as part of some of their sacred rituals. So it's been a quest of mine for some time to have those two groups presented side by side so we could take a look at what these traditions are that they have sustained and hopefully make us better understand what they are. So we have brought them here, 25 people, and they are doing a series of performances today. Many of y'all know Nick Spitzer and the show American Roots. We were at the Jazz Museum doing a live taping. So that is why I came racing into the Zoom. So if y'all want to see what that looked like, New Orleans Jazz Museum streamed that live, so you can see it from their Facebook page. But to come, a documentary and sound recordings.
Thank you for sharing that. Again, I know that's a departure from this issue, but from what I know from everyone on here, I thought everyone would be interested. And plus, it's so kind of Heather to take out time in the middle of that to come to this. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Justin, I'm going to turn to you. I'd like you to introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about your story, but I also have a different question. Which is that obviously each contributor on this call is talking about how their work intersects with restaurants, whether it's John as a critic or Heather as a folklorist. And I know that you too are a professional food writer, but I'm so interested in how your work intersected with restaurants as an attorney. Because I know that lawyers always seem to be meeting in restaurants, and even in your piece for Gravy, you talk about sort of a private club, which I imagine had many attorneys among its members. So I'm wondering if you could briefly talk about restaurants from a lawyer's perspective.
That was not the question I was anticipating for this panel. Well, I'm glad. Well, now I have to, come up with the response impromptu, which I guess is good. But first of all, I had so many thoughts when Heather was talking, when John was talking. I was like, I wish there were more time I could respond to all these things. But John, when you were talking about the next tasting menu thing, it made me think of, the 11 Madison. A couple iterations ago, they were doing the whole like old New York thing with like you picnic basket, and then you get like, a magic card trick. So, anyway, I look forward to reading your story. I have a lot of thoughts on storytelling and fine dining as well. So I'm curious to read your thoughts. And Heather, your what you were saying kind of made me think too. It's like it's not just the story; it's also like the storyteller. And that was something that also came up in my piece as well. Of like the evolution of who's telling the story, not just what the story is, right? So just a couple of responses to these fascinating presentations that we've heard already. But in terms of how my lawyerly, so anyway, backstory, I am I'm the restaurant critic for the Richmond Times-Dispatch in Richmond, but I did not start that role until 2019. I'm actually a full-time lawyer, and I've been doing that for much longer. It's probably even though I have been doing it much longer, it's a part of my professional background that I feel like most people don't really even know that much know about, because I talk about food more often than I talk about the law. But in terms of how it intersected with the development of this piece, I'd like to say that in kind of doing the research for the piece, that everything kind of just went according to plan, but that is not how it happened. There was some strategy involved in trying to do the research, but a lot of it was just dumb luck. I had as a lawyer, one of the things that really stood out to me about this story about the Blue Willow Inn, as I began digging into the material, was they kept making all the materials that I looked at kept making these vague allusions to this desegregation or a series of desegregation lawsuits against what before the Blue Willow Inn was the Upshaw Clubhouse, which was this racially segregated clubhouse in the up until the mid 70s. but there were no details anywhere. And as a lawyer, that piqued my interest because I wanted to know more. And so it turns out that I ended up emailing because I was a lawyer, I had the ability to sort of understand sort of where I might find this kind of information. So I emailed every courthouse and all the judicial archives I could think of in the area, and kept turning up empty-handed. But finally, I got a hit from the National Archives in Atlanta, and it turns out they were the ones who had the banker's box of materials on these lawsuits that had been filed against the Upshaw Clubhouse, which was what previously occupied what is now the Blue Willow Inn, that estate. And it was clear this was a box of paper files that had never seen the light of day. Things were still stapled together. So that ended up being a very fruitful source of information that led to other sources of information. It was where I found a copy of Mr. Upshaw's will that spelled out some of his less savory views on race. And it also led me to find out who some of the named plaintiffs in this lawsuit were. And I happened to then, after I went to the archives, I took a trip down to the visitor center in Social Circle, Georgia, where the Blue Willow Inn is located. And sort of knowing what I had found out about the court filings and who the named plaintiffs were in this case, I then happened to stumble across a series of articles in which it talked about, there's this civil rights activist named Bobby Howard that the town had just recently named their main bridge after. And I was like, well, that name sounds familiar. And I went back to the court filings, and it turns out in a sort of poetic way that he was actually one of the named plaintiffs who fought to desegregate the Upshaw Clubhouse, which then became the Blue Willow Inn, and which is now, and this is the positive side of the whole Blue Willow evolution, has recently been acquired by an African-American entrepreneur from Queens, New York, and a West African immigrant chef after decades and decades of very racist history. So I guess that long story short, that's sort of how the legal piece of it came in. It actually became a very, it led me down a series of paths that really helped develop the story.
Right. And so, I mean, it's always interesting when you get a bunch of writers together that everybody starts from a different point. I mean, there are always, reporters who prefer to start with paper, the documents, and those who prefer to start with just talking to people. Which kind of leads me to my next question to Mike. Mike, if you want to introduce yourself as well. For those of you who came on the call a little bit early, I was talking about there's a new food court in Pineville, just outside Charlotte, Alley 51. Where Mike is going to be having a sketching workshop. Is it this weekend? This coming weekend? Anyway, so just had the chance to go there. But I'm just so curious, as someone who is completely visually illiterate, I would love to hear what you saw when you walked into this new space, which again is sort of a food court associated with a very big Asian supermarket.
Yeah, no. So yes, hi, I'm Mike Dicobara. I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I'm an artist and a designer here. But regarding food, I sketch my food a lot, probably more than my wife likes me to do, because I have to make her wait to eat before I finish drawing it. So that's a little bit of my addiction. But in Pineville, right near Charlotte, is a new food court that opened up. It's inside a really large Asian supermarket. And it's probably one of the best in our area, actually, even all around. It's one of the bigger ones, and a food court is surprisingly quite. I wasn't expecting much, actually, because they just kind of did a soft launch, didn't really do much advertising. And I went there, and just the quality of food and the variety from the different Asian cultures. It's not just your standard like Asian food. It's from cultures that you don't really see much, especially in our area. So yeah, I just can't wait till they get even more ramped up, because I know they're still working on it. But yeah.
It's again, I'm so curious, when you bring in these students, I don't know how much experience they have sketching. What will you tell, will you tell them to focus on one stall, to focus on the people, the food? What instructions do you give?
Sure. So for this one, I'm not teaching. This is where so I'm part of a group called Urban
Okay.
Sketchers.
Yeah.
It's a global nonprofit where we go out and draw from observation. So that's what Urban Sketchers do. We pick it could be in any medium, but the point is that we draw from observation from real life. So this is where we're meeting up at the food stalls, and everyone could draw whatever they want. They could draw food, they could draw people, but they're drawing from life. But regarding drawing food, I am teaching a workshop at a coffee shop. So we go around town in different parts of town and coffee shops. And I have a 3-hour workshop where we meet with the students, and I teach them to draw what they order, typically coffee and a muffin or some type of food. Then I teach them that, hey, you don't have to finish fully drawing. You could start eating it. It's okay. You have a photo to work, to paint off of in terms of coloring. Then when we draw in the surrounding environment, whether there be other patrons in the coffee shop or the interior or signage or logos, and that's how a whole drawing is finished up. And your whole coffee shop experience is visually captured. So.
Cool. Let me actually, well, why don't we stick with artistry for a moment? Flora, if you don't mind. Flora is on the art team for the issue. So Flora's the only one amongst us that I've not met before. So I'm going to have to count on her to sort of introduce herself. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Flora, is not just, as I asked Mike, sort of how you look as a restaurant as an artist, but I'm really curious about how you look at the art in a restaurant as an artist. So many make use of it in one way or another, again, returning just because we just spoke of it to this Alley 51. I know they have murals and things. And I'm wondering if you have any reflections on how restaurants use art. A big question.
It's a complicated question.
Yeah, for sure.
I see the restaurant in two ways. One is the locals, how locals see it, and then I imagine how locals see it and how the travelers are seeing it. Because I'm visiting Miami tomorrow, and I was thinking of like what restaurants should I go, and I just search on the internet and I try to find places that are beautiful, that are the food are beautiful. I can take photos and I can send them on social media. And I also think of what are the local food that is actually good, and the people living there actually go there. And so I want to experience the life the people living there actually are living. So when I trying to draw stories of a restaurant, I think of these two ways. And because I feel like these foods are helping me to understand the culture of this area better. Yeah. I don't know if I've answered it clearly.
No, I just, again, I'm always curious because I think restaurants, and when they sort of try to, may perhaps not manipulate people's stories, but certainly they want to create a mood. Art is often part of it. And I feel this way even as a critic, that I'm not an art critic, and I'm not necessarily qualified to pass judgment on what they've chosen to hang on their walls. And I'm always curious what it might look like to someone who knows something about visual art.
I feel like this is based on the restaurant owners, their vibes. But some are just trying to
I know I'm putting you on the spot. I totally get. I know I didn't warn you about this question, but I just thinking about the experience of creating a restaurant experience. That's all.
Okay.
I won't pressure you any further. I'm sorry. It's so unusual for me to get to talk to an artist. Okay. Although you are all artists, I didn't mean to imply that you are not. Alice, and I'm so excited to talk to Alice because Alice, I do know. We worked together in Dallas. So I have not had the opportunity to work with Alice since then, which was what, a while ago. I don't know.
I think
15
a
years?
500,000 years ago.
A
Yeah.
gazillion years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know what that note is, what that means. Anyhow, what's great about Alice's work, and this is I'm hoping you'll speak to, perhaps this is just being in Dallas, but it's also being Alice. I feel like a lot of your work has to do with taste and lack of it. Or good taste, bad taste, and certainly it's something you touch on in your story. So I don't know if you want to talk about the story and the ritual you chronicle, or just broadly about what you see when you are, for instance, out and reporting on Dallas's social clubs. What do you want to say about restaurants and good and bad taste?
Yeah, so I have a writing background, but not really like I still, even after many years of writing about food, don't feel qualified to write about food. So I typically gravitate more towards describing the people watching that I love to do. That is really my wheelhouse, because I feel like it's really hard to tell other people what food tastes like. Like that's just really hard for me to wrap my mind around. So I've really gravitated towards just the people in a restaurant and what happens when you put different kinds of people in a restaurant and how they might react differently to the same thing that happens in that environment, right? So the thing that I wrote about for this piece was the ritual of the happy birthday song, and how, like, you know, I had a whole bunch of different ideas for what I wanted to write about. But when I was talking to my friends who had experience in the restaurant industry, the visceral reaction that I would get about, like, hey, do you remember having to sing the happy birthday song to tables when you waited tables? Immediately everyone was like, oh my God, it's terrible, I hated it. And like, some people love it, some people hate it, and whenever you go over there, like, you're gonna get a reaction from the table and it's gonna mess up your tips. Like suddenly people had emotion connected to what I was writing about, you know. And I look for that. Typically I really like it when there's something like, I mean, you're saying basically you hate the happy birthday song. Like, to me, there's something ridiculous and fun in that. Because everyone really does, like, if you're on the receiving end of having happy birthday, like, yelled at you by a team of like people who don't even want to be doing that, it can be very intense. Or if you're just at dinner and other people are having the birthday song sung to them, maybe it's ruining like your perfect first date or whatever. And so yeah, I just started to look into that, and then it got like more and more ridiculous the more I like did a deep dive into like the history of why restaurants don't sing just the regular happy birthday song. Like, I didn't know that it's because it was not in the public domain for so long and they were trying to avoid licensing fees. And so then I was like, well, Hannah, what if I can find the person? Because I grew up working at Bennigan's in my neighborhood. And so I was like, what if I can find the guy who wrote the Bennigan's version of the happy birthday song? Because like that's, or lady, like that person has a story to tell, you know, like how many versions did they write? Anyway, I became obsessed. I think it resulted in something ridiculous. I hope you guys enjoy reading it. I had a really great time writing it. And mostly it's just like, it was fascinating to me to find out all the things on the internet about the happy birthday song, like good or bad.
This is probably a good segue into Sherry, because so much of your piece is about being a sleuth, I sort of think, and figuring things out. Sherry, do you want to introduce yourself and say a little bit about what you wrote about?
Sure. I'm Sherry Castle. I live in just outside of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I'm a food writer. I'm a cooking teacher. I'm a recipe developer, and I have a show on PBS, a cooking show that's for home cooks. So what Hannah asked me to write about is ghostwriting a restaurant cookbook, which I've done some. I've written a total of 16 books, which is a lot for your average Joe, but fewer than some people. And some of them are ghostwritten books. And my first thing I thought of when, well, I tried to talk her out of me doing this, but she insisted. and I thank her for it now, but is that writing a restaurant book is different from writing other kinds of cookbooks, including even celebrity chef or celebrity non-chef books. Because if you're going to a restaurant, the one thing that is true, no matter across the gamut, is you don't do any of the cooking. And if you are cooking in your home, it's the antithesis of that. You are cooking the food. And how is it possible to bridge that gap? And if so, how do I go about it? And so my essay is a more or less a compilation of anecdotes, recollections, and so forth about what that process is like. And it really comes down to, well, I will say I was lucky that for almost all of these, the people generally wanted the food to come across in a repeatable way, which is not always the premise of a restaurant cookbook at all. And it also recognized that, you might be able to recreate or approximate the food, but you're losing all of that restaurant experience because you're simply not there. So for me, when I started this, and this is what I wrote about, is that I, went in, it's like, what is this dish about? What is happening here? What's in this? Why is it here? What were they trying to do? And then how would I do this at home? And then how would I tell someone else to do it in their home? So it's really as much of a translator and ambassador work as anything else. And sometimes that works really well. And sometimes it's a big ask to figure out how you would try to get someone to attempt a restaurant caliber where you have some sort of kitchen that usually does not resemble the one we have at home. And you have people who are being paid for their skill in food preparation and in preparing food that someone is willing to pay for. And how you do that if you're on your own in your shabby little kitchen all by your lonesome. So that's more or less what I write about.
Right. And I think you're talking about too, it's sort of that balance of the magic, right? If you can do it so easily that you don't need to go to the restaurant, then maybe the restaurant doesn't deserve a cookbook after all.
Well, yes and no, because I thought about that, because in hearing you all, a question I've had this evening is, what is the tipping point that something is a restaurant? Is it an experience where you can get something to eat? Is it is every place that sells ready-to-eat food a restaurant? I think, there's a lot of things. Is what do we consider to be a restaurant? In my case, on the books that I happen to be, and by the way, I was anonymous on these. There are some people that are what I call a wither, where you're acknowledged you're a co-author in this. I was kind of brought in as in the dark, literally in the dark of night on one of these, because no one was speaking anymore, and this book was due, and maybe that would have been the more interesting story. But anyhow, these people, at least there was something about the food that although you were experiencing the restaurant, you were more or less there to eat, and ambiance was part of it, and the art on the wall and the trees outside and all that were part of it. But by and large, people went there because the food was delicious, not because it was going to have some element of shock and awe beyond deliciousness.
It's such a great point, Sherry, and it brings us back to the beginning with the German restaurant that no one got to see, which might be very in line with all the magic they want to create, that you just couldn't see it. It's all ambiance and no food, is exactly what John was talking about. But that sort of was my closing question too, which is really exactly what you said, Sherry. So thank you for articulating this so succinctly, which is kind of what is a restaurant and what is a restaurant for? And I wondered if anyone, now having heard one another speak, if anyone has any thoughts they want to share before we close out.
Well, I want to say, I think that some restaurants, that it is the experience, and I'm not saying this is good or bad, but I bet you we've all had that thing where we have spent 3, 4, 5 hours or more in a restaurant where there was foam and feathers and floof and falderall and stuff, and we all went through a drive-through for order of fries on the way home because we were starving. And does that mean they failed? Not necessarily, but I don't believe that their main impetus was to feed people food. They were there to feed imagination or something else.
Any additional thoughts from those who have spoken?
Somebody else needs to say, John Kessler needs to weigh in on this, because you and Hannah both eat. You're in the restaurant world. I'm in the home cook world.
John,
Along the
anything?
lines of what you were saying,
Sorry.
you know,
I
go
mean, you
ahead.
know, like truffle floof is very in this year, so I think I mean, it's really changing, right? I feel like, you know, there's so many, what is a restaurant is a really good question, because so much of what people go out to eat now are like these collaborations, right? It won't just be going to a restaurant, it'll be one chef visiting another chef's restaurant, and they're doing some collaboration where it's going to be Mexican, but it's also Indian, and you know, they're putting their thoughts together. And so what people really want is this kind of one of a kind experience. um, I feel that is really, you know, in the 30 some years I've been going out and writing about restaurants, that has changed a lot. You know, people want to have this memorable experience that they're going to take with them. And if they like the food a lot, or if they thought the food was just kind of interesting, that doesn't seem to matter so much. I mean, I remember going out after eating at Alinea, you know, the restaurant I mentioned earlier, and this table from San Francisco were there, and I was asking them, well, what'd you think, as we all exit at the same time? And one woman was like, oh my God, it was so incredible. It's been on my bucket list forever. And then her partner was like, yeah, I didn't like it. The food was weird. But I just feel like that's so much of, you know, people are so interested in what restaurants are about now. And I think this bucket list thing, this experience you're not going to have anywhere else, that's a big part.
Right. I thought it was very interesting, Pete Wells' recent column about like the best restaurants in the world or whatever, to say exactly that, that experiences, sometimes you go, you never want to go back. And the question was like, are these even restaurants? Are they good, but are they restaurants? Which is Sherry's
Right.
question. Justin, are you seeing that in Richmond? Are you having a similar evolution of restaurants there?
We don't have like the cool tasting menu restaurants that John was describing. So
Lucky
unfortunately,
you.
that's a whole swath of, you know, but you know, when I was living outside of Richmond, obviously, you know, I've, along the lines of what Sherry was talking about, you know, I'd been to meals like that where it was like, is this a think piece or is this a meal? And I guess you could say, you know, to draw a film analogy, right? Like people watch art house films that are more like think pieces, and then some people gravitate towards like Hollywood blockbusters that just give you that immediate dose of like pleasure and satisfaction. I think one would say both are types of films, right? They just, you know, depends on what you're looking to get out of the experience, I suppose. Maybe that's just a very simplistic way of looking at it. But then again, like, you know, I've also heard people take a very literal approach to defining a restaurant, and it's based on what the physical space is, right? Like there are some people who like pop-ups don't get to make restaurant lists because they're not restaurants. Or, you know, I've heard, you know, here in Richmond, we have a number of wine store restaurants. I don't know if that's a trend elsewhere, but they're like little eateries housed inside of what is essentially a bottle shop, and its main, you know, its main business is as a bottle shop, but it's like this intimate little like 10-seater. I've heard one owner of a bottle shop here say we weren't allowed to be on a list for best restaurants. I forget the publication, but I guess the editor had said, well, that doesn't qualify as a restaurant. And I reviewed it as a restaurant, and I would consider it a restaurant, but I guess it depends on, you know, I guess you can use different metrics to define it. That wasn't a very helpful response, but I feel like.
No, I think we're all figuring it out. Any other questions that people have for one another, or anyone who hasn't taken themselves off mute yet that has anything to add to this conversation? All right. All right. Well, we're sort of over time. We try and keep these to 45 minutes. So I don't want to keep you any longer. I know you've given very generously of your time. Again, thank you to all of you who contribute to the issue, those who are going to read the issue. I think you're going to be very, really excited by it. One of the things I really wanted this issue to have was a lot of energy and humor. And I hope you get the sense that came through. And we will be having our next food section Zoom, which I certainly hope Brave will participate in as well. But our next food section Zoom is 1 month away. We tend to aim for the last Tuesday of the month. And in keeping with the theme of summer, it is a talent show. So we already have folks signed up with what they claim are talents. So I hope you will join us for that. If you have a talent, you can also perform. And I think that's all I've got. Thank you so much. It was such a treat to see you all. Thank you. I hope you all have a great night. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Thank you, everyone.